My name is Desiree Anderson Crow, and I'm a professor here at the School of Public Affairs. Thank you for being here on a Friday night in particular. I know we have probably twice as many people or more online, which is not surprising on a Friday, but thank you for those of you who braved the traffic and the Friday evening to be here in person. I think tonight's conversation is a really important one to have. As we know, we have 10 days until a very consequential election. Tonight, first of all, I want to thank a number of folks. Tonight's panel is sponsored by the Herrick Roth Lecture Series and the Worth Chair in Sustainable Development at the School of Public Affairs. So I want to acknowledge that. Also thank our Dean, Paul Teskey, who could not be here because one of our major national conferences is going on in DC right now. And so a few faculty and our Dean are there. But tonight we want to talk about election 2024 and disinformation and the role of disinformation in elections administration in this election cycle in particular. So Colorado's 63 elected clerks and recorders are the state's election officials, and they are our front line for administering our elections. They have a pretty challenging job. Matt can talk about that from personal experience in terms of all of the things they're expected to do. Elections is just one part of their very complicated job, but in their elections administration, they have to ensure safe and fair and accurate elections administration. But of course, since 2020 in particular, we all know that that job has become more complicated because there's been increased interference, increased misinformation and disinformation and threats to our clerks and recorders. And so they really are on the front lines of protecting and ensuring and furthering our democracy. And so tonight we're joined by Matt Crane, who is currently director of Colorado's County Clerks Association, but he's also the former clerk from Arapahoe County, which if you're familiar with Arapahoe, is one of the counties that they always point to. Arapahoe and Jeffco is these incredibly important because they're very purplish counties, and they're sometimes represented by Republicans, sometimes by Democrats, and so the spotlight is on those counties in particular in terms of election administration. And so we can talk and learn a lot from Matt tonight. We also have Sandra Fish, who I will say on a personal note, Sandra and I were on the faculty together at the former School of Journalism and Mass Communication on the Boulder campus. So it's fun to see Fish in person, in real life, again. But Sandra is a kind of retired journalist. She's a very well-known data journalist here in Colorado, most recently with the Colorado Sun. But she's worked in Colorado journalism for a very long time, very well-respected data journalist who's covered everything from campaign finance to fundraising and polling and all of those questions. When you think about where numbers might be part of the conversation and data might be part of the conversation about elections and campaigns, that's where Fish comes in. So thank you to both of you for joining us tonight. I think I want to first kind of establish, because we talk a lot about misinformation these days, I first want to establish this kind of common understanding of the term, because misinformation can happen as a result of the nefarious acts and disinformation, either from nation state actors. We know that there's a lot of conversation about, sorry, they were glaring at me. I need to stand closer to the microphone. I'm a walker. So, but we know that after 2020, there was a lot of conversation about bots and social media and so forth, spreading misinformation. Oh, thanks, Dee Dee. But I apparently, all right. Okay, now I can be a walker. But so misinformation can also happen simply because information and news happens at such a rapid pace, especially, for example, on election night, when there might be news about kind of something happening at a polling place and long lines and so forth? And is it, is there some sort of kind of nefarious thing going on there? And misinformation can kind of come out of situations like that just simply because it's a moment by moment story. It's a moment by moment, learning what's happening there. But also, we've certainly been talking a lot about this kind of intentional disinformation over the past 4 years in particular. So I think we can talk about both of those things tonight, but I suspect a lot of what our conversation will be about misinformation, or disinformation, sorry, that kind of intentional manipulation of information. But we'll use that misinformation term as kind of an umbrella term. But I just want to kind of establish that because sometimes it's just accidental. Journalists doing their job, a good job, and things changing moment by moment. So with that in mind, I first want us to get a little bit of an idea of just what the role is of our county clerks in Colorado and how hard their job is, quite frankly. So I'm hoping, Matt, you can begin by talking about how elections are administered in Colorado in particular, and the role of the county clerks. I mean, we are a national leader in voter turnout and election administration. So tell us a bit about that.
Sure, I'd be happy to. First of all, thank you for the invitation to be here tonight to join this conversation. Thank you to all of you, both in person and online, who are here and listening to us and participate. Hopefully, we get some great Q&A and we can have some fun conversation around that too. The role of the clerk and recorder is something else. It's when I was county clerk in Arapahoe, I always used to say that the role of the sheriff is very clear. The role of the coroner is very clear, and then of the assessor. And it's like they took just about everything else that really didn't have a home and they put it in this one office, the clerk and recorder's office, because there's no real rhyme or reason to why these things are connected. So of course, it's in the name. Recording. We handle all of the recording processes for the county, which in a lot of ways is the backbone of county government. Recording of legal documents, of real estate documents, issuing marriages licenses, those types of things. And then we also are responsible for the DMV at the county level, which issuing license plates, those types of things. And then there's this election role where the clerk and recorder is the chief election official for the county as well. So lots of diversity of job, of scope of work each and every day, keeps the job interesting, but there's a lot to do. And so when you think about it, in large counties like in Arapahoe, I had a staff of, I think when my term expired, of between 120 and 130 people. And I had people dedicated to each different part of the office. In medium and small size counties, they have much smaller staffs. And in many cases, when you go into those offices, it will be the clerk who not only will issue you a marriage license over the counter, but they will also be the same person who issues you a driver's license or a license plate, as well as the person who hands you a voter registration form or a ballot during an election, should you need a ballot. So there's a tremendous amount of work that these men and women have to do on a day-to-day basis. And so when we look at that, the job was hard enough coming into 2016. But then we come to 2016, and on the election side, we see foreign adversaries who try to hack into different voting system or election systems. They try to hack into our voter registration systems. So after 2016, along with all of this administrative work that these men and women have to do, they have to become cybersecurity experts and IT experts. Okay, that makes the job much harder. But at least in late 2016, early 2017, President Obama designated elections as critical infrastructure, meaning local election officials had the full weight and support of the federal government behind them to protect their systems, which opened up a lot of resources and tools to help with that. So that was a very good thing. And then 2020 happens. And we see something unlike anything we've ever seen before, where there is a massive disinformation, and I have another term for you as well, malinformation, which we'll talk about in a minute, campaign that's led by the sitting president in an attempt to hang on to power. And the level of stress that put on county clerks, where most county clerks never want to be in the news. It used to be in the old days. I mean, Fish can tell you this. If a clerk was in the news, it's because something really bad happened in the election operation. So it's not their instinct to get in front of a microphone and talk a lot about what they do. But now they're getting confronted at their grocery stores, at their churches, at their synagogues. Hey, what happened? Why didn't you fix this? Why didn't you stop this? We see clerks getting death threats all across the board, because it's especially hard on Republican clerks, and I'm a Republican. When you go into a room of people who think an election is stolen and you say that's not true, the people driving that narrative are lying to you for political and financial purposes. People don't really like to hear that, right? Especially when they have so much invested in the candidate who lost the election. So beginning in 2020, clerks now have to become communication experts. And as the threats keep escalating between 2020 and 2022, now physical security experts, right? So now the focus is on hardening our offices, on our the security around our offices, our ballot boxes, our homes, to make sure that our people and our operations are safe. So really, when we talk about and now 2024, where everything is just, it's a tinderbox and things are completely nuts. It's a very difficult challenge for clerk and recorders in this environment. We've seen a third of our folks turn over the last couple of years. Now, some of that's just due to natural attrition through term limits, but we definitely lost clerks because the environment was becoming so difficult for them to work in, where they are getting death threats. They do see county commissioners in some of these communities trying to undermine them and work with bad actors. And so it's been a very challenging environment, again, on top of their day-to-day job, which is issuing marriage licenses, driver's licenses, license plates, those kinds of things. So it's a very rewarding environment. The people who do this, most of them, we've had one recent bad apple who, wanted to win a beauty pageant instead of be a serious policymaker and understand not the power, but the responsibility voters give you when they elect you to these things. But these clerk and recorders, they're men and women of service who want to serve their communities. And the job has become so much more over the last 4 years because of the environment that we're faced with.
That's a terrific summary, but overwhelming to sounding.
And then some.
Fish, I know that we heard a lot in the public dialogue about voter fraud and so forth. I know you've done a lot of data analysis and research on this. Can you tell us a bit about kind of what we know, how prevalent voter fraud is, and what types of voter fraud we actually see?
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to this Friday night party. Oh, yeah. It's rare. And actually, one of the things that I find really interesting here is that the Heritage Foundation, which is a really conservative organization, keeps a database of voter fraud instances. And they have in their data 19 cases in Colorado since 2005. And, like their most recent one was a guy who voted his mother's mail-in ballot in 2022. I think he was convicted in 2024. There was Barry Morphew. That is a name that you might recognize. His wife had gone missing on Mother's Day, and he later voted her ballot because he knew that she would want to vote for Donald Trump. And he was convicted. I mean, a lot of these cases are not, duplicate voting, and nationally, it's pretty rare. You hear about some of them, I think in Florida, in the Villages, which is a place I would never live, but it is for people my age. It's really weird. And like at least they charged 4 people who lived there in 2022 with voting both there and in their home state back north. And I mean, it doesn't, now we do have this case that has come up this week. And I'd like to hear more about that, frankly.
Yeah, maybe now's a good time to talk about this. So if you read the news today, I read it in the Colorado Sun this morning, and they were reporting that in Mesa County, which is also where Tina Peters was clerk prior to this, that there was some election fraud discovered and is being investigated. And you were quoted, Matt. So I'm gonna hand it over to you to find out more about that.
I was gonna say, did something happen this week? There isn't. I have to be very careful because it's an ongoing investigation right now. But what I can tell you is that the process that we have here in Colorado worked to identify fraud, in so much as the county clerk and her team, Bobby Gross in Mesa County and her team, started getting calls from people who had received a cure letter. Now, for those of you who don't know what a cure letter is, with every mail, despite claims to the contrary, we examine the signature on every single mail ballot that gets sent in every county in Colorado. If there's a multi-step signature verification process conducted by election judges, citizen judges, people like you, your friends and neighbors, synagogue members, PTA members, Elks Lodge members. And so if a signature is found to be discrepant, meaning it doesn't match any of the signatures we have in your voter registration file, then the ballot is rejected, or the ballot envelope is rejected, not the ballot. It doesn't go any further in the process. We send the voter a letter. It's called a cure letter, saying, hey, we examined your signature. If it was a discrepant signature, it doesn't match what we have on file. If you did sign your ballot and you did vote it, just fill this form out, let us know. If you did not, please also let us know. Now, if we don't hear back from voters on a cure letter, we automatically send that to the district attorney. In this case, in Mesa County, they received multiple calls from voters who said, I didn't vote that ballot. I haven't voted yet. Why am I getting a cure letter? So through the clerk and her team started looking at this. They saw some things that were very concerning to them, and they got with law enforcement. District Attorney Rubenstein, who has done a fantastic job on just a fantastic job in general, but on election-related issues over the last couple of years, which unfortunately Mesa's had their hands full. And now it's an ongoing investigation to try to determine what happened. But that's going on, but the system did work. Signatures were rejected, cure letters issued, voters, just as important, voters notified the county that something was amiss, and now everything's under investigation on it.
You know, I would note that it's likely that they'll be able to figure out who did this and how they took the ballots probably out of the mail somehow, which I believe would be a felony. And, you know, you sort of didn't mention her name, but I mean, Tina Peters has just been sentenced a month ago, earlier this month, to 9 years in jail and prison. And she's in jail right now. People take this stuff seriously. But it's disturbing to me that there are all these people out there spreading rumors and asking people to send their ballots or take photos and email them to places. I mean, the Colorado Republican Party earlier this week sent an email to county Republican Party chair people and the state central committee, urging them to be part of this thing and be like on the lookout for people voting illegally and all these things. And it's like just filled with things that are not true. You have some pretty prominent Republican. I spend way too much time on the internets, and you have prominent Republicans out here, the former gubernatorial candidate from 2022, who are promoting this sort of just total misinformation and encouraging it.
And I am glad that's a perfect segue into talking about this conversation about information and security and election security. I think it's also important to point out that our system of all mail voting was a bipartisan thing when it passed. Our Secretary of State in Colorado was a Republican who supported that, along with, what year was it? 2013, along with a Democratic governor. And so it's not something that at least until recently in Colorado, at least, has been super controversial, but I'm sure you can speak more to that, Matt.
Yeah, it is ironic, you know, and one of the unique things about Colorado, we have a very civic-minded population, and that's always been, we've always done well in voter turnout, even before we went to a mail ballot delivery model. And that's one of the awesome things about living here, is that we do have an engaged citizenry. But one of the things we've also done as an election community here is go where the voters ask us to go in terms of what kind of voting opportunities to provide for people. So for example, in 1997 or 98, Colorado was one of the first states in the country to allow for no excuse absentee voting. And then in 2005, as more and more people were applying for an absentee ballot, we said, well, let's make it a little easier for you. You can sign up to be on a permanent mail-in list, where if you want a mail ballot for all elections, you just let us know that. You don't need to tell us every election, and we'll continue sending you a ballot. And that never negated your right to go vote in person, by the way. If you decided one time, hey, I just want to go in person, you could do that too. In 2008, we went to a all mail ballot primary, mail ballot delivery primary. And then in 13, we did make the jump to all elections with a mail ballot delivery. One small correction: the secretary at the time was not it was a Republican. He was not in favor of it, but the vast majority of county clerks were in favor of the mail ballot model. So over a 15-year period, we grew up in this mail ballot environment, and we were very smart and strategic about moving forward when we were ready to do so. So we could harden our processes, we could harden our systems, we could harden our security, our communication, so that when we thought we were ready, we made a very deliberate move to sending everybody a mail ballot at the time. And it always was. I'm sorry, one quick thing to your last point. For the longest time, I started in elections in 2000. The Colorado Republican Party embraced early voting and embraced absentee voting. A lot of the Republican population tended to be older, and for seniors, voting early, more options, voting early, getting your ballot at home, allowed them to be able to participate. Where if you look at some of the states that are election day voting only, or very limited early voting, or very limited absentee voting, you tend to see long lines on election day. And that has a suppressing effect on everybody, but especially seniors who don't have the endurance to stand in line all day to wait to get in to vote. So the Republican Party always embraced this. It was only, until, the state demographics, the demographics in the state started changing in the late aughts into the 2010s. Republicans started losing elections they used to win. I'm a casualty of that in Arapahoe. I lost in 2018. But it was demographic changes. It wasn't an election change. But rather than embracing the truth about why Republicans were losing elections, they blamed it on how the elections worked. Had to be fraud. And then when you have Trump, and we can talk about this later, whenever you want to, but when you can see the seeds of disinfo, especially around mail ballot and early voting, it just had a catastrophic effect on the Republican Party and their ability to accept the truth about elections and why the party is winning and losing elections generally.
Yeah, that's I think an important point as we start. Let's shift gears to talking about this presence of misinformation, disinformation, malinformation in elections, and what you've both observed, how that's changed over time, but also the effect of that. I believe you'll know the numbers much more accurately than I do, but I believe in the last presidential, Colorado voter turnout was something like 87%, which is, if any of you know, American voter turnout is really abysmal. And so Colorado is always one of the top 2 or 3 states. And
second to Minnesota.
Yes. Yeah. And I think you I'm sure know more about what Minnesota does, but Oregon's the other one, and they also have all mail ballots. And so what does misinformation do to that turnout? Who still turns out? How does it change our elections?
So much of it depends on the timing of it. I mean, I can tell you, if you look at it, a lot of the garbage about Dominion voting systems started right here in Colorado, by a bad actor who made up lies about somebody who worked there, and then it just went like wildfire through the Trump campaign, through Giuliani and Sidney Powell, and all of whom their checkbooks are a lot lighter right now because of the claims that they've made. When you look at the effect of disinformation, and I mentioned the term earlier, malinformation, it's when somebody takes a shred of truth, something that is true, and they create a whole narrative, a whole lie based on that truth. For instance, voting system components in Colorado they do have Wi-Fi capability, and so that means anybody can remote in. Well, they never talk about the fact that it's disabled at the beginning before they're ever used. We verify that it's off. We do lots of audits and checks to make sure it's not on. They conveniently leave that part out, and they go with the rest of it. They create their lie for their political or financial grift. But when we talk about the direct effects of it, look no further than control of the United States Senate. After 2020, when all of this Dominion garbage was going around, President Trump, Lynn Wood, and others were going around Georgia after the 2020 election in January of 2021, saying, don't vote on the Dominion machines. It'll show the algorithm, and it'll prove that Trump really won the general election. Republican turnout in elections they generally win, these senatorial runoff elections, was depressed, and the Republican candidate lost. So there was a direct result of this disinformation costing the Republican Party. And yet that still wasn't enough to shake people to wake up to say, hey, wait, stop, maybe we should slow down. Because of course it didn't reveal any algorithm, because there was none. There was no cracking in the voting systems. And all Republicans were left with in Georgia was, gee, well, now we have a Democrat representing us, and control of the US Senate literally turned on that seat, all because of a lie.
Go ahead.
I feel like some of this is, although you're right, the origins of a lot of this come from people here, but a lot of this is more impactful in other states. People here are used to voting by mail. It drives up turnout. This is one of the reasons that people are fighting that. You had people resorting to that because of COVID in 2020. And there are people who don't like it because it drives up turnout, and people who might not otherwise vote have all the time in the world to sit down and fill out their ballot and look things up and either mail it in or drop it off.
Right. One funny thing about this too, some of the biggest spreaders of disinformation here about the mail ballot process and about the stolen election, it's really funny. When you look at how they vote, their voter history, oftentimes they vote a mail ballot. The other thing, if you think mail ballot is fraudulent and it's not going to be counted right or whatever, why would you do that? The other thing too is these people run for office election after election after election. Well, if you thought the game was rigged, why would you keep putting your name on a ballot? See, their actions don't match their words. And that's a big tell. Look how people act, look what they do, not what they say.
In terms of what you see here in Colorado about our own elections in the state, does the information surrounding our elections match what we're seeing nationally, or is Colorado somehow different in terms of how the presence of misinformation, the type of things we're seeing?
I'll be honest. It caught us off guard a little bit after 2020. Colorado is not a swing state anymore, right? Colorado's pretty solidly blue at this point. So the fact that we have such an election denier movement, in many ways, the election denier movement is centered here out of Colorado. Mike Lindell's contract with America, all of that got started with people from here. A lot of the Dominion lies got started with people here. And then it spread to places like Arizona or Michigan or Pennsylvania or Georgia. But a lot of that garbage got started here, and I'm not quite sure why that is, because again, Colorado's not. It's not really a swing state anymore, but for some reason it does. So that's one reason why we have to be particularly vigilant here, because a lot of times what starts here ends up in these swing states.
During 2020, I did a fellowship with something called First Draft News that was on mis and disinformation. They have since gone out of business. A lot of the people who were researching this in this field in politics have been sort of persecuted by House Republicans. They've been called in and accused of doing all these things. So you don't have as many people looking at this stuff. But I have been following a lot of these people on social media and various channels, from private Facebook groups to Telegram to, Twitter, of course, to Truth Social. And that's how they kind of organize. And it's a bunch of people who they really are true believers in this stuff. And, I've interviewed candidates who are true believers in this, and, you cannot dissuade them.
No, and that's when social media is a great advance for society, but it's also a serious, bane on our society as well, because now with social media, disinformation can amplify so quickly. And there's nothing that we have as election officials. We don't have the same followings on social media. There's nothing that we can do to outrace the bad information as it goes out. So we have to be very deliberate and very methodical, but it amplifies so quickly.
I'm interested in some of these examples that Heidi Ganal is asking people to share, and she's then resharing them. And in one instance, somebody had shared their ballots, and the El Paso County clerk responded on Twitter and said, okay, I've looked at these, numbers on this ballot, and your son moved to Boulder at the end of September after our ballots were already printed. So of course he got a ballot in El Paso County. And he said, we'll cancel that. He does appear to be registered in Boulder. We'll take him off our rolls. But I mean, when you're responding to something like that while you're also trying to run an election, and I imagine people are deluged by stuff like this.
It is. It's a lot. And this trend of running to social media to try to get sunshine to feel important about it, rather than just picking up the phone and calling your clerk and getting a direct answer to it. They're looking to feed the narrative, not solve the problem. And it's problematic. And, just in this case that Fish is talking about, when a ballot got printed, it got mailed. As soon as that person updated his voter registration address to the Boulder address, the county goes in. We see that, right? The address gets updated. The ballot that got mailed becomes voided. So if somebody tries to return it and come back in when the barcode is scanned, we're going to see that the ballot is voided, and we're going to begin an investigation and hand it to the DA because somebody voted a fraudulent ballot. So it's not just like it's a free-for-all, come one, come all, and we have no checks in place. Clerks work every single day, every year, to improve the integrity of our elections. Does that mean it's perfect? No, especially when it's a process run by people, and our election judges are phenomenal people who do great work, but they don't, this isn't a career where they do it every day, 365. They work with us for a couple of weeks, once or twice a year. Right. So we train and do the best we can, and we continue to mature and strengthen our security processes. Perfection's unattainable, but we chase it every day. But the thought that we don't do anything and it's a free for all, it's just not borne out by the facts. This case that Sandra talked about, the Mesa County case, shows our systems work to identify issues.
Talking about the folks who help elections run, some of them temporary paid workers, others volunteers, polling judges, or and so forth. How has the last 4 to 8 years of American politics changed who's volunteering or who's helping, or whether people want to be a part of that process? What does that look like for a county clerk's office trying to recruit those folks now?
Well, we've seen a lot of turnover, and especially after 2020, it wasn't just clerks who were getting threatened or, facing intimidation, harassment, doxing. It was our poll workers, our election judges too. Those lists are publicly available. And so people would put in open records requests, go and then, go and confront those folks. And if let's say if they're a Republican, hey, you have to do what's right by the party, do something nefarious, that kind of thing. And we did see some longtime folks who were very good at this decide we don't want to deal with this anymore. But I think sometime in 2022, I think a lot of folks, both full-time clerks and full-time employees and our citizen election judges, they kind of got their second wind, and they said, you know what, this is not right. We are not going to back down in the face of these bad actors. And they re-engaged. and came in because it is our republic, our democracy that's on the line. And if good people do nothing, right, evil wins. And so we really saw a recommitment from folks, which was incredibly encouraging and gave, clerks a second wind at this too. Like, okay, we have a strong army of people around us who believe in what we do, who work to make it better every day. And damn it, we're not going to let these bad actors undermine everything we believe in.
That's great. Go ahead, Fish.
I really feel like clerks are really doing a great job of being transparent too. Like up in Weld County, Carly Coppas is the Republican clerk, and she has really had to deal with a lot of people in that very heavily Republican county. And she brings people in and she shows them how things work. She encourages them to be elections workers so they can see, I am somebody who has had their signature rejected twice in the 6 years I've lived in Denver. My handwriting is terrible. And it's helpful. Other clerks will do open houses where you can go in and see what the equipment looks like. It's, they've done a ton of work of trying to educate the public.
I appreciate you, Matt, kind of describing to us what that very complicated process is and all the data and people are moving every day and so forth. Do you have any concerns, either of you, about the integrity of our elections this year going forward, either because of the existing process or because of new threats, because of this conversation that is being held in the public sphere?
Well, I think there's always concerns, right? We clerks, as I mentioned, clerks hire across the state. There are thousands of poll workers who come in, and our training has gotten so much better. We work with them. We try to bring a lot of them back to keep working. But again, these are people who do this work for a couple of weeks, once or twice a year, maybe every other year. And so that is a challenge, to be able to train people to keep up with all of the operational changes, the process changes, the legal changes, and to have a real tight attention to detail. But that is something that we keep working on. So that's always a concern, to make sure people are dotting I's and crossing T's. But one of the things that we're also concerned about too is there's been so much disinformation in the public square about what we do, that we're concerned, like in Mesa, that people may try to test these systems and overwhelm clerks, in different ways. And so that is something we're worried about. And then, we've focused so much since 2020, as I said, on physical security and protecting our people, which is a big concern. There in Phoenix, I think it was Phoenix, there was a USPS box that was lit on fire. It had 20 some ballots in it. There was a poll worker who was in an altercation with an angry voter or watcher down in Texas. Like, these things are happening. There are physical concerns, but there's also, going back to 2016, the cyber concerns. All of the intel coming from the federal government is Russia, Iran, China are doing what they can to cause problems in our election process. If not trying to hack into systems, then by amplifying disinformation, which is one of the things that just drives me nuts when you have somebody, these bad actors, who go out for their own political, and make no mistake, it is for political or financial gain. It is not some virtue that they have to make our civics in our elections better. It's for political and financial gain. They are useful idiots for Russia and Iran and China, who they don't have to fire a shot at us to cause problems here. They can look at what they've done after 2020 by amplifying messaging on social media to turn Americans against each other, to turn families against each other, because they disagree on whether or not somebody won a damn election. It's like taking candy from a baby, and we have too many people who fall right into that trap. And I don't know what happened, if there's a suspension of logic or whatever it is, or there's such an emotional tie to a candidate that lost, but common sense has gone out the window. The ability to validate information has gone out the window. People get their information from fewer and fewer sources. So just keep this in mind about our systems. It is far easier to manipulate people than it is systems. And the election landscape has proven that time and time again over the last 4 years.
I like that. That's a quote I'll use. It's easier to manipulate people than systems. You've alluded to this a couple of times, Matt, with former President Trump, but this week it was in the news that he voted earlier by mail or both. Is there something, do you think that that will change things for the narrative if prominent Republicans start to shift their own narrative?
Well, you say start to shift, or if they just tell the truth that they've always been voting earlier by mail. That would be a big start, a good start. So my hope, so I think there is, the way that we've approached this is that the people impacted by this, especially on my side of the aisle, on the Republican side of the aisle, there are some people on here who are either leading the grift or they're just the true believers. And I always say that, you know, Jesus Christ could come down himself and these people would be like, yeah, well, thanks for dying on the cross and saving us, but you're wrong, forget it, right? Like they would just ignore it. But then there's this opportunity group out there. There are people who have, just like all of us, we have emotional connections to candidates. And they're concerned because all they hear about are messages about stolen elections. They don't have a way to validate it. They work hard. They don't have time for a tour, but they are open to good messaging. So I think for those folks, it will validate the choices that they're making. But we still see from this, you know, the extremes and the denier community, they're actually going after President Trump for saying vote early or vote by mail because they want people to vote on election day because they think that you know, here in Colorado, for instance, you know, that evil Jenna Griswold is going to look at the votes and start flipping votes if Republicans are way up. So for a lot of folks, yes, it will help. But for the true people that are grifting and the true believers, they're turning on Trump even. I'm not sure what would help.
I'm seeing in the too much time on the internet stuff I'm seeing divisions within these election denier types of like, no, don't vote on election day because, you know, people are trying to sabotage whatever's going on election day and blah, blah, blah. I mean, I guess if the weather is bad on election day, that it will be, they control the weather. I don't know.
Right.
Before I start with a couple of questions from the audience online, I would love to know if, with only 10 days left until we go to bed and wake up on election day and find out the results of this consequential election, if you have any concerns about malfeasance or the security of elections this year, or if you feel confident in those systems like you have in the past.
I feel confident in our systems. I do have concerns about people testing those systems more and more. And I think in some ways, the last 4 years has been a testing ground for people. You know, I was just talking to somebody today, a former DA in the state. We were talking about some of this, and, you know, he was saying a lot of it is like, you know, what law enforcement agencies have to do when fighting terrorists, right? You can see over time how people try to test security and see what they can get away with the idea of planning for the big event. And so we're concerned now that this is the big event and that people are doing it. And clerks are literally up 24 hours right now, trying to think of everything, looking over our processes. If we see a gap, how can we close that gap? You know, something always pops up. What can we do to mitigate that? So Mesa shows our process works to identify fraud. More people we feel are testing it and are going to test it over the next 10 days. And that's even before the disinfo that comes out, which will put increased pressure on clerks, especially if there's a close election. So there's plenty to be concerned about.
You know, my concerns are more that, you know, Trump began in August of 2020 trying to discount the election and mail-in ballots and other things, you know, to set the stage in case he lost, to say that he didn't really lose. And he's been doing that since the get-go now. And he has a lot of people. You saw what his followers will do on January 6th. And that's kind of my concern, you know, because you are hearing some of this rhetoric from some of the organizers, you know, the people who are mad because Tina Peters is in jail right now. They are saying some pretty violent things. And that's sort of my concern.
And one example that comes to mind, and Sandra, that what you just said really kind of kicked it for me. When we talk about a former gubernatorial candidate here in Colorado who doesn't believe she lost, and she's encouraging people to go out and observe drop boxes. And she says, we're going to follow all the relevant laws, but then at the end of her speech says, but send money in case we get arrested. And with the history, especially in certain communities that are historically underrepresented in the voting process, we worry about voter intimidation. Hell, in all communities, we worry about voter intimidation, but especially for those who have been impacted by it so much historically. And so anything that can be seen of that, it could lead to physical altercations at these drop boxes. So those kinds of things concern us greatly too.
Thank you. We have some good questions coming in from Zoom. So first of all, maybe a pretty straightforward one. What are the repercussions for someone voting on someone else's ballot?
I believe in Colorado, well, it's definitely obviously illegal. I believe it's a class 2 misdemeanor. I think I'd have to double check that.
I can't remember specifically, but I think there have been some people who've served a little jail time,
Yeah, class 2
definitely
includes jail time.
fines. And I mean, it's just pretty easy to prove. I mean, the burden of proof is not too
Well, and
difficult
like
to
I said,
achieve.
any question we have, if somebody doesn't respond to a cure letter, it goes to the DA. So they may be out of town on vacation when the cure letter comes, and they come back afterwards and they're getting a knock on a door from an investigator saying, hey, did you commit fraud? So we do
wow.
take it very seriously, and we look into all of this.
I'm going to save this one because this is a good one to end on. But you touched on this slightly, but how has the rise of technology and social media platforms changed the landscape of misinformation surrounding elections?
social media is a shithole. Pardon my language.
I agree.
One of the things, the positive things I would say, and like I said, I spend too much time out there. Twitter at its all-time high had like 25% of the US adult population on it. Now it's more like 20. And the people I see out there, especially when I see candidates who think their voters are there, no, your voters are not there. The people on Twitter are like hardcore politicos and shit posters and journalists. And, there's a Venn diagram out there. I may be some of those. But you really have to be cautious, and I would do better to get away from social media, but it's what is fomenting the spread of this information. People are in their private groups, sharing this information, and then they're out there spreading it further on various platforms, not just on Twitter, but probably on TikTok and other places too.
I think it really reinforces something that we try to say too. One, go to your trusted source for election information, which is your clerk and recorder. But more importantly, go to more than one source, right? If you're stuck in Twitter, you're stuck in a vacuum. And you're choosing who to follow. You're not going to get a balanced perspective on things. It's especially true now as we see AI, artificial intelligence, get more and more mature and what that looks like. And election officials have spent a lot of time over the last couple of years, studying AI. There's a lot of great uses to it. I think we all know that. But there's also some malicious uses, that deep fakes, right? Or, robocalls where you can send somebody and say, you can't vote here. You have to go all the way across the county where there's a long line. So, we've tried to get much more adept at understanding those technologies, understanding technology provenance and how to protect that so people can know it's coming from the clerk. But again, don't go to just one place. If you see something online that's suspicious, call somebody. Don't just act on it, or especially, please, don't just repost it, right? Have some patience and some discipline. Say, okay, this looks concerning. Let me research it. And then if there's a there, okay, repost. But please be responsible when using.
That's great advice. Fish, as a journalist, I'm curious, the journalists were roundly criticized in 2016 for not calling out some of the lies and so forth. And then again in 2020, there's been some conversation about how journalists have felt a bit more comfortable in their skin, fact checking and so forth with former President Trump. But how would you assess kind of the state of political journalism in terms of asking those tough questions or fact checking both candidates? Or
it really varies. And I kind of feel like the national media isn't always doing a great job of the scale on what's important with one candidate versus what's important with another, and what one person said versus what another person said. You know, to me, for voters, I just think it's really important for you as a voter to think about what issues matter most to you. It might be the economy, it might be taxes, it might be reproductive health, it might be the environment. There are numerous issues, and to do your research and find good sources of information on, like, look at the candidates' web pages and their policy pages, but also compare what their positions are and who represents the things that you care most about. Don't just go along because your friends or your family members say these things. Like, one of the things I've liked that we've done at the Sun is just doing a grid and asking, like, congressional candidates, here are the same questions. Some of them are yes or no. Here are questions on national issues, and you can compare the candidates and see who shares your position. And I'd like to see more focus on that, but it's a personality contest too.
Right. Another question from Zoom. Have any states passed laws that allow for prosecution of persons spreading disinformation or malinformation?
Well, I know it's certainly been discussed, but the challenge for that is the First Amendment. And where that's really become clear for clerks is when clerks receive threats or threatening language, and they go to law enforcement, they're like, well, that doesn't quite cross, it doesn't quite cross the line into a crime. As a free speech, absolutist, it's one of our greatest things we have as Americans. I also think about what our founder said, where, only a moral and responsible people can have a republic. And what we're seeing now is people choosing to undermine the republic because they're not being moral and responsible in how they have civic discourse. They're willingly lying, again, for political and financial gain, and that's going to undermine everything we believe in.
Yeah, I don't think you would see that, but you have seen some cases just this week of somebody who, from Cortez, I believe, who threatened Jenna Griswold, the Secretary of State, some other people, being taken into federal court. And there have been cases like that, I think, in several places around the country where the threats are being taken seriously.
I want to invite any of you here to ask questions. Anything top of mind or burning questions you'd like to ask? Yeah, go ahead. Dee Dee has a mic coming up.
What do you need from our elected officials for the county clerks to feel supported right now and going into the future to ensure the safety of our elections and their safety, and make it a less toxic environment for people to work in? Because it is noble work. It's hard, but it's noble, and it deserves the respect of every citizen. So how do we support that?
Well, I really appreciate that question. The simple answer, right, is always more funding for our elections, especially around the security side. A lot of the things we do to secure our elections also improve access. The people that say you can't have great access and you can't have great integrity, they're lying to you. You can do both, and you can do it well. But the biggest thing we need right now from elected officials is courage. There are so many people who have talked to me and other Republican clerks to say, thanks for what you're doing. We agree with you, but we can't stand up and say that publicly because we'll get primaried. We won't get through, and it's important at least that our voice is there, right? And, we're at a time right now where you can't worry about your political future. We're at a time that demands courage, not cowardice. And so the biggest thing that we can get from elected officials is just to get up and say, the sky is blue, not try to say it's purple because you want to get in good with somebody or keep your job. Your job is not more important than the republic, and that's where we're at right now.
question.
I was just going to ask, what are the identified strategies that county clerks are coming together to kind of combat the information? Because I know that this is kind of a relatively new trend, but I don't know what people are doing to actually counter it.
Well, so a lot of it is, and here in Colorado, and I don't just say this because it's my role. We've had a strong association here, over 50 years old, with amazing executive directors who have helped build the culture of where we're at now. One of the things where the job has morphed over the last few years since I've taken over in this environment is about understanding the things that are being said. Like Fish, I spent a lot of time on social media and going into the depths of hell to try to understand what's out there, because that stuff has a way of bubbling up and becoming either something that we have to combat through communication or be aware of from security concerns. And so one is trying to figure out where to go to understand what the information is there. The other thing that we have to do, and one thing that drives me nuts is people, especially not the NIRE movement, say, well, we bring things to clerks and they just look the other way and say everything's fine. That's 100% not true. Anything that's out there, we look at, and we look in the mirror and we say, is there a there? Because if there's a gap, our constitutional job, our oath to you all, is to run free and fair elections and secure elections. We take that seriously. So we'll get up in the morning, we go in every day and look in the mirror and say, what can we do better? Is what this person is saying true? If this person is not saying is that true? And then we work on making sure our folks know about the different narratives that are out there. Let's say it's not true. If it is true, we work to mitigate it. If it's not, we provide our folks with talking points. We spend a lot of time about communication and how to talk to people, different ways to talk to people, when to talk to people. There's been a much greater focus, as I said earlier in the presentation. We never wanted to be in the news before. It was because something went wrong. But now we have to be aggressive in the public square. Now is not a time for wallflowers. We have to be out there. We have to be pushing the truth out there. As Fish said, we do invite election deniers in to serve as election judges, right? Don't take the lie from the grifter. You can come do the work yourself. And we've had great success by inviting people in. And at least they come in and they say, well, if they're in, let's say they're in El Paso, right, a Republican jurisdiction, they'd be like, well, I don't really trust it in Denver still, but at least I trust it here. That's a big win for us in this environment. And then we always have fun in saying, guess what? They do it the same in Denver, right? So, it's a lot of, we've had to adapt and learn a lot of new techniques to be able to study this, understand it, examine it, and then communicate about what's real and what's not.
Good questions. Others?
You all carry?
I would say that more people are carrying now than they were 4 years ago, for sure. The threats, despite what some try to say, are real. We've had, a clerk who was pregnant over the last 4 years, and not only was she threatened, but her unborn child was threatened. It's very real. It's very visceral. And yes, a lot of folks take their own personal security very seriously.
Others? Anyone? Someone on Zoom predicted the question I was going to wrap up tonight with, which is that what can average citizens do to help election officials proactively defend against disinformation campaigns?
I would say be very cautious about what you share out there in the social world and verbally with your family and friends. And if you have family and friends who are spreading these sorts of things, I think it's useful to try to have a conversation privately and to say, wow, I noticed you shared this. Where did you get that information? And ask them to tell me more. What are the details? What is the source? And it's not always going to work. Some people are just so committed to this idea. It's, as the kids say, a little delulu. But just sort of try to have that conversation with people. Or if they bring it up and criticize you for your beliefs, I think it's important to look for those things, those opportunities to discourage people from sharing this sort of information. And, I mean, the thing of becoming an election judge, you can even go to your political party and be a watcher and stand there in the hallway and watch them do the really fun jobs of looking at the envelope, watching the envelopes go through a machine, looking at the envelopes and the signatures, checking them again. And, I just think informing yourselves and helping inform others in your circles.
Yeah, that's so wonderfully said. The great thing about our elections, right? People like to say, especially these bad actors, they'll come after a clerk and say they're fixing elections, or they'll come after Secretary Griswold and say she's fixing elections. Jenna doesn't run an election, right? The clerk is in charge to oversight at the county level, but the clerk isn't the one verifying eligibility and verifying signatures and tabulating ballots. It's you all. It's our citizens. When people say we need to give elections back to the people, guess what? It's the people that run our elections. So I love this question. We love people to be ambassadors for us. The best way to do that is we're very open. We love that. You can tell I love to talk about elections. We all love to talk about elections. Come in, be an election judge, do the work, try different jobs. Then you can go out, and when somebody says, hey, there's a cracking in the voting system, you can be like, you know what? That's crazy. I was there. I did the work. Not only are you lying, but you're insulting me and my integrity. Because by saying that our elections are fraudulent, they're insulting our judges too, which is terrible, right? So come in, sign up to be a watcher. As Sandra said, political parties have meaningful observation. One of my favorite things, right? 2020, Giuliani, if you were paying attention at that time, is outside of the polling place in our central count facility in Philadelphia. And he says, we don't have meaningful observation. Our watchers aren't in there. Well, guess what happens when they got in court? Their court filing said they had a non-zero number of watchers, which I don't know about you guys, but that sounds like they had watchers in the room, right? So all over the country, this is true. It's not just here. There is observation. You can be a poll worker. So join us, come be an ambassador for us. And if you have questions, please call us.
That's great. Any other things that you would leave us with tonight in terms of takeaways 10 days out?
Yes.
What can we all do?
First of all, make sure you know the deadlines around voting, right? That's it. So if you want to vote in person, know where you're going to go. Believe it or not, some folks don't know what county they live in, which is fine. So know what county you live in and what vote center you can go to, where your ballot drop boxes are. Ballots have to be back by 7 o'clock. Postmark does not count. But the biggest thing I want to advise you of, and I think you guys, I bet everybody here is a pretty prolific voter. You vote in election after election. So then hopefully despite the disinformation from the last few years, if a race is close, we may not know who wins the race for 10 days. Now, why is that? Is that because there's something nefarious going on? No. It's because, especially in states that rely on mail ballots, there's a huge influx of ballots at the last minute. It takes time to verify signatures. It takes time to open those ballots. It takes time to tabulate those ballots. It's nothing nefarious, but again, if a race is close, it could take a while. Also, during this whole time after Election Day, while we're counting ballots, political parties can send watchers in to verify everything is happening right. So there's meaningful observation, nothing nefarious. But what I typically say, if somebody's up by 7 points on election night, yeah, okay, you can probably sleep pretty good. But every now and again that's flipped. But if it's closer than that, buckle up, settle down, be patient, and just wait for the results.
And seriously vote,
Yes.
and when you vote, do your research. Go to places like the Colorado Sun, Colorado Public Radio, Denverite, the Denver Post, Colorado Community Media. They have all done Q&As with the candidates, especially the people at the local level have the biggest impact on your lives, to be honest, not the president. And do that research and get that information, because that's the most important thing you can do.
Don't forget to sign your mail ballot envelope too.
Well, thank you, Matt, and thank you, Sandra, so much for being here tonight. And thank you all for your good questions and attention. So
Thank you so much.
go vote.
Thanks, everybody.